beyond just hunger reduction, immune modulation? What are some of the other benefits you get from focusing on Akkermansia bifidobacterium in your diet?
Number one thing is insulin function. So those two, they work synergistically and they work kind of on their own too. So bifidobacteria can actually influence composition of bile acids, and then from there, that actually influences insulin secretion, insulin sensitivity, and that works in conjunction with Acromancia, which stimulates GLP-1, but also does a number of other things related to helping insulin do its thing.
Joel, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks. Thank you so much for having me.
Making the trip up here to talk about all things immunity code and a lot more.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, Joel, I mean, you've been in the health and wellness space for how many years now?
Like full-time since 2006, and then as a consumer dabbler since I was probably 13.
Yeah, so. That's fantastic. So I always like to start off all of these guest appearances with just some quick outtakes from you about what your perception is about everything going on in health and wellness. And so let's start off just real quick, talk about nutrition.
Sure.
What's kind of the biggest mistake you see people making when they're talking about nutrition or considering their dietary regime? What are you seeing there? What do you tell people to look at?
They don't factor in time. They don't factor in that things don't stay the same over time. So something can work incredibly well up front, and then it can have a phase where it doesn't work so well, and then it can actually be negative long term. And if that were more generally known, it would really change the landscape.
Yeah. Like, do you mean specific foods or specific dietary patterns or both?
Really anything.
Really?
Anything. Yeah, you see that pattern. So, it's really interesting. So you being in the medical field will instantly get this. When you look at drugs, time is part of the framework.
Yeah.
It's part of the paradigm. So if you're going to prescribe someone an SSRI, you probably tell them up front and go, okay, well, look, so up front, you're probably going to see these benefits. You might even drop some weight. You're going to feel this. However, if you stay on it too long and do too much, we can see this long term. And so there's this accounting for time that is missing with diet. It's completely missing. Like, you don't hear that about diet.
No,
you just hear like,
rarely.
Carnivore changed my life, bro. It's the only way to go ever. Always. Don't say anything negative, or you hear the same. You hear the same thing about everything. There's no acknowledgement that things can change over time, and that's a missing reality.
Exactly. It's so true. I find that in my practice as well. Like, I recommend for certain individuals even to go keto, but for a specific amount of time. Number one, because it's not fully sustainable. But number two, there's long-term changes that are potentially deleterious compared to the short-term positive interactions that you have with that diet, right?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. You never hear this.
Yeah.
Ever.
Yeah. And so it's so important to realize it's true for a lot of things. I've had a few people on this podcast talking about even workout routines and things. When you're exercising, if you're not changing it up and doing some sort of periodization training and moving things along, you're just going to stay stagnant, and even worse, you can even hurt yourself over time. So you're absolutely right. Well, let's dive into that more here as we talk. So let's talk about exercise, since we're on the topic. Exercise, movement. What's your recommendations for people to consider? I know you're a big fan of workouts, and tell me what your take is there.
The most important thing is obviously that you do something every day. In my first book, I talked about what I called the integrated interval, and it's really the idea that what's going to impact your life more than anything long term will be just small pulses of exercise across the day. So if you can squeak in 20 to 60 seconds 3 to 4 times a day, highly intense, just go right back to what you're doing, that will have a greater impact on your life than actually working out will. When we call working out, we mean like either going to the gym or doing that. And the problem over time, particularly under like you don't get paid to be fit. The problem people run into is the time required to go to the gym. So just taking these micro sort of incursions into either intervals or VO2 max or a number of different things, but it's the fact that across the day you're taking 20 seconds to a minute, you're doing this, you're going right back to what you do, and you're just inserting those. And that really for me came out of I was running a tech company in the early 2000s, and I came into that like super fit. and then I got so fat, and I was fat. I was big because I was going to the gym, but I was fat. And really, at the end of that whole thing, I sat down and thought, what did I do wrong? Like, I've never been fat like this. And it just really boiled down to I needed a strategy that better fit into that world. And so the number one thing really was just, particularly as you get older, circulation's going downhill. You're starting to accrue inflammatory milieu in tissues, and you've got to move. You've got to move, and you have to integrate that into the day. So that's really the number one thing is that.
Yeah. Yes, I think you're right. There's this big focus on, our current lifestyle now is you go to work for 8 hours and you're basically sedentary that whole time. And then the cure to that, I'm putting that in quotes for people that are listening because it's really not the cure, to go to the gym for an hour after work, right? Or before work.
Yeah.
And like what you're saying in reality is having movement throughout the day is what's really going to keep you fit. And do you think a lot of that is from just kind of eliminating that sedentary behavior pattern, or is it also from the direct kind of benefit you get from the exercise that you're doing in those little micro exercises throughout the day?
Yeah, great question. I would say offer two things. The first is that, generally speaking, the decline of the vasculature is kind of front and center. Mm-hmm. So as the vasculature has to do two things well. It's got to get glucose and oxygen into tissues. And so as the ability of the vasculature to do that wanes downhill, what you start to see is, all these different phenotypes, the SASP phenotype, all of these different inflammatory phenotypes where inflammatory milieu begins to just kind of aggregate and you don't have the circulatory power to remove it. So, 2 hours go by and you get up and you're just stiff and sore and I got to kind of shake that off because it's an hour by hour proposition at that point once the vasculature is not working well. So these quick incursions have the benefit of moving everything around, which is very helpful. And then they also have the added benefit of just stimulating energy production throughout the day. And the way to get energy is when you don't have it, you got to expend it. So I would say that.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And getting into a little bit of the specifics there, when do you want, say you're sitting there at your desk, right? How many minutes of sedentary time do you want to stop? Would you want to get up and start moving around? And then for how many minutes? Do you have actual?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. So I've actually, so originally it was called the integrated minute. And I did some seminars in 2017, live seminars with people, and we would do a minute at a time, roughly every 2 hours. And boy, I'll tell you what, 1 minute every 2 hours, like max intensity minute, it's brutal. When you get to the end of the day, let's say you worked a 10-hour day, that's 5 1-minute intervals. Mm-hmm. It really starts to tip into the realm of that's kind of a lot. And we had a contest trying to do 1 minute an hour, which sounds amazing. Yeah. Most people can't finish that. Huh. 1 intense minute per hour will put most people down by about hour 8, hour 9. It's really amazing. And you could prove this. You could pick any movement. You could do, okay, I'm going to do push-ups. I'm going to do sprints. I'm going to do squats, something. Just do it for a minute straight. And it is incredible how a very total duration being very short but very intense spread throughout the day, you really don't need much of that. It really is amazing.
Isn't that incredible?
It's amazing.
Yeah. I think people think that being fit takes a lot of time, but in reality, it might only take 5 to 8 minutes a day and you can maintain fitness from doing it every, I'm saying these 1 minute intervals every hour or two, right?
I would say that you can maintain. I think in the real world, what most people are up against is an upward slope of weight gain over time. Mm-hmm. Meaning, if you're in let's say a 9-to-5 environment, or you're in that kind of a thing, it's very difficult over time to mitigate weight gains. Extremely difficult. Extremely difficult. Most people, and I just say this. First of all, I never understood what weight loss was. I didn't understand it. I just thought, why don't you just go work out? I don't know. Why don't you do that?
A lot of people think that, right?
And then I started doing these corporate wellness engagements. And I remember one we did with the city of Phoenix. And I was sitting in the city hall. And I'm sitting in this huge city hall. There's 1,000 people there. And they're all there to consume, how do I change this problem? And I'm looking at everybody there. And I realize, oh, wow. Most of them can't work out. Wow. And the light went off in my head, Mm-hmm. So, and all of that, that's a complex thing. Yeah. All the variables that go into that. But the number one mitigating factor is time.
Sure, absolutely.
It's
always time.
Yeah, and so I would just say it just depends on where someone's starting. But certainly, what you can do is begin to arrest the decline, and probably get a leg up on it. I would offer in most cases there's going to be some period required where you're going to really have to eke out, some dedicated amount of time to, depending on how far gone you are, to solving the problem. Right. But yeah, that's kind of a long answer to a simple question, I guess.
No,
Sorry
that's great. It gives me a lot to think about there. So let's talk about sleep. What's some advice you have for your clients that talk to you about inability to sleep, insomnia, et cetera?
Boy, the number one thing I would say about that right now is dietarily speaking, when you're young, you've really got to take serious the decline of the pineal as you get older. So the problem is, as the pineal begins to calcify, I never believed that, by the way. I didn't. I thought that was just kind of some woo thing, and then I went and dug up all the research on it, and wow, it's a real thing. Yeah. So as I began to dig up the research on the pineal calcifying and kind of looking at that and looking at, well, how do you mitigate that? A couple things stood out. One is that you need phytates in the diet to do that. Phytates tend to mitigate the calcification of the pineal. And it just gets down to the long-term accumulation of the bill coming due after decades of certain practices. And so you can see that in the cardiovascular system. But one of the ways you really see it is once the pineal begins to calcify, it's very difficult to fix sleep issues with people. So I would just say, if you start early, dietarily speaking, through a really healthy, balanced diet, the preventative payoff from that, the dividends, are mind-boggling. And it took me 40 years to figure that out. Wow. Because what you begin to see as you get older, and it's very common nowadays, you see people have no problem falling asleep, but bam, they're up at 3, 4 in the morning, okay? And they cannot shut it off. It's widespread, and there's a lot of things going on there. But at the top of the list is a key mechanism that needs to do certain things that's not functioning properly, and that's a big deal. So,
can you tell us a little bit more about the pineal gland and its function and how that's related to sleep?
Yeah, it's interesting. So, the pineal melatonin secretion takes place in the pineal. Right. Okay. Now, what's interesting about that is that most of us think that melatonin is a pineal hormone. It's actually not. It's a mitochondrial hormone. It's made in the mitochondria across the body. It's just that in the pineal, when melatonin is secreted, it interacts with the body's sleep clocks. And so you have kind of two things going on here, which is very interesting. And there's different theories on sleep. The one that to me seems to make the most sense is the competition between process S and process C, where process S, if I'm recall, I might get these mixed up, but I'm going top of my head here. But the one is the accumulation of things across the day. So specifically the most important is adenosine. Right. So as the brain begins to blow off all of its energy resources and it's losing AMP, ADP, now you're down to just adenosine in the brain. And once that hits a certain level, boom, you're going to go to sleep. Right. And then there are the diurnal.
That's a sleep drive kind of, right?
Sleep drive, yeah. And that plays with the diurnal clocks. Right. So the body's got its clocking system, its light and dark sensitive system. And the pineal through the suprachiasmatic nucleus plays a big part in that and regulating the sleep clocks. And so you have these two processes that work together and usually should complement each other, but don't have to. For example, you can be in broad daylight, and eat a gigantic meal, and you'll go right out. Or you can be in broad daylight and just completely drained from being on stage for 4 hours and speaking, and you've just blown out every amount of glucose in the brain. You'll go right to sleep in broad daylight. Right. So that's the competition between process S and process C. Right. So all that to say, the pineal plays a really, really important part in there. It's not the only thing, but it's certainly something that you can't really ignore. So
you said phytates keep the pineal healthy, prevent it from calcifying.
Yeah.
And how do you get more phytates in your diet?
Leafy greens.
Yeah.
So what's interesting about that is we're in this era of the vilification of plants and leafy greens, and I just want to say for anybody listening, I'm neither. I'm not the guy going, bro, meat is the way. And I'm not the guy going, no, plants are I'm neither of those guys. Yeah. I'm neither. I'm in the middle of, you kind of need both, and both complement each other. And there's some interesting synergies, really interesting synergies, actually. All that to say, though, so phytates have been vilified to a large degree. What you find with phytates is that you find them in leafy greens, and they are carriers of inositol, which is another way of saying they have a bunch of phosphorus. And whenever you find things with a bunch of phosphorus, typically what you find is they're really good metal chelators. So phytates, things like that, they're good metal chelators. And the argument becomes, well, you don't want those in the diet because they're going to bind minerals in the gut. The problem with that argument is they left out the microbiome. So what happens is when the microbiome is robust with the Keystone species, particularly the lactobacillus and the Bifido species, those actually bind phytates and reduce them down, keeps them from binding minerals. Then you get the benefits of dietary phytate. And the benefits are quite considerable. Actually, above and beyond, the pineal seems to help prevent, to some degree, osteoporosis. They help insulin function. There's all kinds of benefits from having phytates in the diet, leafy greens in the diet. The question really is just a dose issue. You know, you don't want you don't want to have none, and you don't want too much. And when you have a balance between optimal amounts, and then you have an optimized microbiome, you can get the benefits without the downside. So, yeah, leafy greens are kind of a great source of those.
Yeah. I mean, that's the first time I've heard anyone talk about diet as related to sleep, other than in timing. Like, you don't want to eat too close to bedtime. But you're absolutely right. There are maintaining our brain's ability to keep our sleep cycles going through diet is definitely another strategy. And you see leafy greens being, I mean, very rarely do I see kids and teenagers eating leafy greens, right? And so it's kind of been like almost eliminated from their dietary pattern when they should be maintaining a healthy consumption of those, not just for the fiber intake, but also for protecting pineal gland and brain function.
That and the nitrate reducing bacteria in the mouth.
Right.
So yeah, they have a role. It's certainly possible to get too much of anything. So it's certainly possible to eat too much leafy greens, and then you can look at oxalate issues and all that stuff. You can overwhelm the microbiome's ability to detoxify. But, you know, sort of in a, let's call it the adequate, you know, you're getting enough, just enough. Yeah, there's definitely a role.
How does one figure out what's just enough on the leafy greens? What do you recommend for people?
So I'm not a measurement person typically. Like I don't like, to me, measurement is unnatural. Like in nature, you're not measuring stuff, okay? So in the new book, I kind of came up with what, you know, to the best of my ability, I think was a way to mimic patterns we find in nature, which was you have kind of a foraging foods day. And within that foraging foods day, there's variations of things. And then each particular meal, meaning breakfast, lunch, and dinner, has a certain structure so that the higher glycemic stuff, like berries, for example, is in the morning. The more kind of resistant starch stuff is in the afternoon. And then the leafy greens and all that's kind of in the evening. So you have one meal that's kind of saying, hey, include these. Doesn't have to be the centerpiece, but just include these. So they're roughly about 3 days a week, you're getting at least one meal in with leafy greens. And that's kind of how I look at it.
I like that a lot. So save the leafy greens for later on at night, maybe later on in the day, dinner time, potentially is what you're thinking. You know, with that, I'd love to dive into, it's a great segue to your latest book, and I'm really interested. What's the latest book going to be called?
The Way.
The Way. And when does that come out?
It's
out already? Okay, great. So people can buy it on Amazon and all the big booksellers, I assume. And so could you give us a little bit of a background, and first of all, background on you, and how does this kind of tie into where you are today? I know you also wrote the immunity code, and then we can kind of end up at the Way, and I'd really want to dive deep into all the teachings from the Way.
Yeah, sure. Quick, I don't know, lifetime compressed.
Yes.
I was just a consumer nerd for fitness from a young age. So I was a Jack LaLanne guy up every morning doing that, and then I was a running craze kid, and then I just happened to go to a high school where Jenner used to train for the decathlon, and so we had all these Olympic athletes there, and so ninth grade I'm there just doing clean and jerks and all kinds of stuff. And so I got into weightlifting and read a lot of bodybuilding magazines, and I'm just that basic prototypical, you know, kind of just, you know, dumb kid, just like reading through everything. And I was super skinny. I was really skinny. So I was the same height like my freshman year and like 60 pounds lighter. So I was humiliated walking around. I was always wearing jackets. And
How tall are you?
I'm just about 6'2" now. I think I used to be about 6'3". So.
Yeah. Same with me. And I was super skinny back then. And it's like, it doesn't feel good to be tall and thin.
No, it's funny.
In high school, right?
You get shorter guys picking on you.
Exactly, right. That's happened to me.
So I was just obsessed with not being so skinny and all that. So working out became kind of just endemic to me going through life. And so I was not an advice giver or professional most of my life. I was just really a consumer. And what happened is, as I was going through like the 80s and 90s, I was just kind of like the first guy reading like, oh, MCT is great. Let's try these, and in the early 90s, Metrics came out. That was Dr. Scott Conley's meal replacement. And I got ripped to the bone on that stuff. Ripped to the bone. Wow. And Dr. Conley actually owned the health club in Costa Mesa called Club Metrics. And so I made the mistake one day of asking him how it worked. I'm like, Dr. Conley, so exactly how does this work? And so I got this 20-minute soliloquy just dropping like, when you get into the MAPK pathway, this interesting thing. I was just like wham all over my head. But I got ripped to the bone on that stuff. And I thought that was the way. I'm like, this is the way. And then what happened was the effects of time. So about year 4, first of all, I had this horrible constipation because it was loaded with maltodextrin. And I was eating 4 packets of that a day and just 1 meal at night. So it was kind of almost like prototypical like OMAD. And I shredded, but about year 4, year 5, I just could not stop eating. I started eating uncontrollably, and I did not know what I'd done. I'd never had an issue, but I knew the way I was eating created some problem, which in hindsight was, you dysregulated leptin and a few other things.
For sure.
So that set me off on this journey, kind of in the late 90s, where I started trying literally everything. So I had my fresh, whole, organic, raw phase. Then I had my calorie counting, macro phase. I just kind of went through different phases. And it was pretty much always the same story. I would always get really ripped to the bone, and then I would have this weight regain period after, which is really kind of what bodybuilders go through when they do their competitions and stuff. Yeah. And along the way, I tried everything. So it kind of culminated for me in the early 2000s. I went to work for a tech company, became the guy running the company, and we were kind of that typical startup environment where, revenue shooting through the roof. You're on deck 15 hours a day, and my weight 1-to-1 mirrored the revenue growth. It was amazing how that works. So by the time that was all over, it was about 2006. I was lifting a lot, and I was like, I'm a 1X now, I was a 3X. I was huge, but I was fat. And by the end of that, I was kind of like, what did I do wrong?
Yeah. So you had a lot of body fat as well as muscle mass.
Yeah, I had both, yeah. And so that led me down this road where there's about
What were you eating at that point in time?
Yeah, so I ended kind of, I entered into that doing my kind of like tight macros.
Okay.
So I was doing kind of your basic bodybuilding diet, which was like, brown rice, tons of protein, broccoli, just kind of a bodybuilding diet.
Bodybuilding diet, right? Exactly. Okay.
And then as I came out of that, I'd had so many experiences doing this. I just decided, okay, well, I'm gonna drop all this weight, but I'm gonna let exercise do the heavy lifting, and I'm just gonna eat clean. So I was just trying to eat clean and let exercise do it. And I got to about 229, and long story short, I was full-time now in the health space, but it was just producing content. So I was writing articles.
Got it.
And one of the articles that I published was on the microbiome and weight loss, and that led to trying some different diets that were mind-boggling. Like I went from 229 to 212 in 7 days. I went to one of these immerse yourself in water, measure your body fat places, and they measured me at 6.7%. And in fact, a friend of mine, Mark Bell, called me on it. He's like, prove it. I'm like, okay. I called him up, got the PDF, had it sent to him. And that was pretty remarkable. The really amazing thing was my bowel movements were, I would call them equestrian. They smelled very menthol-y. It was this complete retuning of the microbiome in 7 days. And my energy just skyrocketed. I mean, it really felt good. So long story short, I was just making good content that I thought was truthful. And there were a lot of marketers at that point who were kind of commandeering the space and overemphasizing pills and all this stuff. And I didn't like that. And I just quickly found out all anybody cared about didn't care about that. They just cared about losing 10 pounds. Yeah. So I had this harebrained idea to make a software, and I skipped the step where you raise $20 million.
It's always a first step nowadays, right?
Yeah. If you ever want to do a software, raise $20 million first. Yeah, exactly. Note to self. So long story short, that took a I don't know, year or two to develop. And it was really mostly just based on the microbiome for the most part, like the foods in it. So through no effort, nothing of my own, I had a guy come on board who was really diligent, great guy, and he brought a hospital into the picture, and we sold a hospital chain. It was our very first client, and that was Excella Health in Pennsylvania.
Okay.
And they're the biggest employer, I think, in that county. So we had doctors, physiologists, nurses. We had everybody in the medical profession doing this. And the really cool thing was they had their own wellness center where they did all their own measurements and did everything themselves. So they were able to harvest the data. And, at the end of it, we got a pretty good PDF that said, hey, here's the results. And we didn't do it. It's their results. So that was great. And that led to these big wellness engagements with like big cities, really big cities, like very large wellness. And so basically the benefit was I had literally thousands of people coming through this software, and I could just make changes immediately, and then I could just harvest the data. And I was able to just see like, that didn't work. Oh, wow, that's really working. Wow. And so I was able to kind of harvest this data rapidly by about 2013 and pretty much figure out what seemed to work really well. And then that led to, I'd say, roughly 4 to 5 years of just really stumbling and bumbling. Like I did not understand corporate wellness. I just got lucky is basically what it was. And that led to a consulting gig with Quest Nutrition on fasting mimicking. Okay. This was 2016. And so the founder of Quest, Ron Penna, had is really devoted to knowledge. And he had assembled just this really impressive array of smart people. And I had a shtick, and every time I explained my shtick, it would take about 45 minutes. So I at one point, I'm going to write a book. And I didn't have any ambition other than just, I'm tired of explaining my shtick. Right. And that just, like I said, turned into this Rorschach, brain dump, and that became my first book. And then that was published in 2019, and our mutual friend Ben Greenfield had me on the show, and it did really well. This was 2020. And since I wrote that first book, probably the most notable thing was, to me, I thought I answered a lot of questions, but what happened was it just seemed like diet confusion kind of just asymptomatically or kind of logarithmically just shot through the roof. And the impetus for the second book was really just based on like getting DMs every day, like, I'm so confused. He says that, you say this, blah, 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 So
there's so much dietary confusion out there, and lots of mixed messages and people getting up on soapboxes and thinking what they do is the best. So your first book, The Immunity Code, tell me a little bit about why you named it The Immunity Code. Obviously, it's focused on the immune system, focus on gut health as well. What was kind of like the top 2 or 3 takeaways from that book for you to give to most people through that book?
Well, the number one thing, which is very popular today, but nobody knew about at the time, was that you could rapidly shift the gut immune axis through 2 Keystone bacteria. So if you focused on feeding Akkermansia, muciniphila, and the family of Bifidobacteria, you could rapidly produce these really profound shifts in a number of different indices. So if you had examples would be, and I'm just quoting anecdotally, like things people have actually seen happen, longstanding gut issues were ameliorated, gut dysbiosis, food intolerances, gluten intolerance, dairy intolerance, inability to drop body fat, all kinds of things, just from focusing on 2 Keystone bacteria. And the reason really had to do with immune cells. So in the gut, the largest collection of macrophages in the body, not uncommon to find the wrong phenotype there, the inflammatory type, and that through just shifting the interaction, or rather shifting those 2 taxa, the interaction they have with the immune system really affected everything else. And so that was like a simple thing that anybody could do. And in fact, the first book just started with a bag of apples, literally.
Really?
Yeah. And it's like, right now, go get a bag of apples. Start eating apple peels.
Any specific kind of apple?
Just red
apples. Okay.
But it was the skin. So eating the skins of the apple. So.
And that feeds Akkermansia?
Feeds both. So
feeds both, okay.
Yeah, what you have is the skin of the apple has a number of things. It's got these highly polymerized procyanidins that are these massive long chain, 30,000 units long, and so they get stuck in the gut and they ferment really well, and they feed Acromancia, they feed Bifido, and a whole bunch of other things. It's actually kind of interesting when you dive into apple skins and what they do by themselves. It's pretty fascinating stuff, and it was just catchy. it was like apple skins. It was kind of like the next gimmick.
Yeah.
But it wasn't a gimmick.
Yeah.
I had
really
used
worked,
this on
right?
my brother who had Down syndrome, and he went. Literally, I have this on film. He went from day 1 not being able to walk 20 yards to day 7 walking a half mile, and a complete transformation in his personality. Complete. And he had Parkinson's onset, which happens a lot with Down syndrome as you get older. And Parkinson's has a gut aspect to it. It's not completely that, but it does have a gut aspect.
Sure it does.
So it was like night and day. And so that whole sort of just thing of at the center of the gut immune axis, there's just a couple bacteria. And that was at the time when everybody was just talking diversity. Yeah. And I just kind of came along with this thing of like, yeah, that's important for carb digestion, but as a practical focus, if you think about feeding Akkermansia, what it needs, and feeding Bifidobacteria, what it needs, and just focus on those two for about a week, you'll surprise yourself.
Wow. So yeah, and now people, like I'm having Colleen Cutliff on, I don't know if you know her, she's developed an Acromancia probiotic as well, and lots of research that her company is doing around Akkermansia and GLP-1 production, and how, Akkermansia is basically your gut microbiome making the same peptide that these drugs give you to help control hunger and all sorts of metabolic effects. And so I think, having tools to really support the Acromancia in your gut is obviously like very beneficial beyond just hunger reduction, immune modulation. What are some of the other benefits you get from focusing on Acromancia, Bifidobacterium in your diet?
Number one thing is insulin function. Number one thing is insulin function. So those two, they work synergistically, and they work kind of on their own too. So the family of Bifidobacteria has varying but very unique effects on bile acid composition. And so Bifidobacteria can actually influence composition of bile acids, and then from there, that actually influences insulin secretion, insulin sensitivity, and that works in conjunction with Acromancia, which stimulates GLP-1, but also does a number of other things related to helping insulin do its thing. The really interesting thing about those two is the way they seem to work together. So Acromancia you can think of it as a starvation bug, ultimately. So it's fed by fasting. It's fed by phenols, but it's also fed by fasting. And so what you see with, if we just change out our words and we use the word starvation, what you see in starvation is the gut lining's always worn down. Sure. One of the reasons is you have this mucin eater, which is Acromancia. It eats the gut mucus layer. Well, it just eats too much. Gets out of control, thins the gut mucus layer too much. So Bifidobacteria acts as a controller on the excess of Acromancia. And so you need both is kind of the simple way to think of it, because the one keeps the other from getting too much of the Acromancia.
How does one know if they have a problem with gut diversity and gut bacteria, specifically Akkermansia, Bifidobacteria, and lactobacillus levels?
Yeah.
How do you know that? Do you believe in stool testing or?
That's such an interesting question. You're probably way more up on me than the latest tests, but the last time I looked at testing, one of the issues around testing, so two things. One, it's a bit like the weather.
Yeah.
The thing is that the enterotype of a person can change so fast that it's kind of like you get the test back, and literally you could institute some dietary changes and in 5 to 7 days have a radically different microbiome. That being said, there are certain bacteria that if they're there, you want to know they're there. Example would be Fusobacteria nucleatum. Sure. You want to know if that's there because that's a highly predictive cancer promoter. Exactly. The other side of that, though, is just, and again, this is where I might be a little bit deficient in terms of understanding maybe some of the newer tests, but kind of the last time I looked at this, the issue was a lot of these GI-MAP tests were based on one gene. They were based on the 16RS ribosomal RNA gene. And basically that's a gene believed to be common to most taxa, if not all taxa. And then, somebody somewhere has a library saying, oh, well, Akkermansia has this flavor of that, and we're going to map that up. But you have to reverse polymerase amplify all that to get anything. And so then you can't tell if the bacteria are dead. You can't tell if they're alive. So you can't actually tell what the makeup is of the population, and then you can't really see the substrains. So like with Acromancia, there's now like 5 or 6, 7 substrains now known, and you can't really tell which strains you have. And all that to be said, I've probably softened a little bit. And I think when I wrote my first book, I was kind of like, look, the simple test is the smell of your poop. Okay, when your poop smells rancid, something's wrong. And you can fix that rapidly. And when your poop stops smelling, that's kind of how you know. So
they're good points. I mean, I think the resolution is improving on these tests, but there's still so much research to be done. And like you mentioned, we're not even testing for subtypes. There's probably, I would think, 50 to 60% of the gut microbiome that we are not able to detect what it is. And it's so true. Like you travel, changing time zones can change your gut bacteria. One night of poor sleep can change your gut bacteria. There's a lot of things that change your gut bacteria just instantly, like you said. And so when you get that one moment in time with a stool test, sometimes it's not painting a full picture. But it is very useful getting those strains that you want to make sure you're detecting if that can cause something bad to happen, and you want to detect those as well. So, yeah. In your book, did you, besides the apples, give us a few more techniques to improve our microbiome?
Well, the main gist of this is just an inventory of to-dos that I figured out over a few years, and so it's basically you're stacking apple skins with human milk oligosaccharides, with resistant starch, and with red phenols. Those things.
That's the stack. Those four.
And I added later on. I added kind of the other end of the spectrum, which was NAC and AKG and glycine. So those things also do other things that are good, like they go after biofilm and other things. But the original basic stack was the red phenols, the HMOs, the apple skins, and now I've added resistant starch in as well. There's some really great products on the market. So.
Absolutely, yeah. How do you get resistant starch in your day-to-day from whole food? How are we getting resistant starch in our diets?
Yeah, so roots, generally speaking, roots and tubers, and the interesting thing about that is. I've looked at a lot of ancestral studies, a lot of ancestral research, and there's two foods that seem to bubble up no matter almost 100% of populations that ever lived, and it's roots and meat. Roots and meat. Yep. And roots are the food of last resort. They're nobody's first pick, but they'll keep you going. So generally speaking, roots are an easy way to get resistant starch in. Legumes and, particularly when you get into like chickpeas, soybeans, black soybeans, all these things, they have such uniquely profound effects, and they're different from one another, that they're worth having a place in the diet because they have these long chain oligosaccharides that are just slightly different from one another, and they do different things. So other forms of resistant starch. One that I've been big on for a long time is semi-green banana, and I have a very old protocol that involved grapefruit and semi-green banana as a kind of like a test. You could just to prove this to yourself, you can just start eating grapefruit and semi-green banana, and then just kind of eat that throughout the day. And what will happen is by about 6, 7 o'clock at night, you're ready to run through a wall. I mean, you're so ridiculously energetic, and it's a combination of all the AMP-K from the grapefruit, and then all the B vitamin production from the resistant starch. But it's a nice, fun proof you can do, and I would just say have some sleep aids standing by the end of the day. But
that much energy.
It really is, yeah. And it's anybody can do it. You can go do it tomorrow and prove it to yourself. And that's one thing that's cool about that is it just shows us the power of food.
Yeah, absolutely. What about like cooking rice and then cooling it and turning it into resistant starch in that way? Are you a believer in doing those kind of things?
Oh, 100%.
Yeah, exactly.
Cooking and cooling, yeah.
Yeah, cooking and cooling is a really great way to get resistant starch in your diet. So we talked about apple skins in depth. And is there like a dosage of apple skins, like 2-3 apples a day? Or what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, the key is titration. So what you find, particularly nowadays, what I find is the average person, and it's crazy, I'm sure you've noticed this. I mean, you must probably have a lot more data than I do. I'm just speaking anecdotally, but I have just seen this logarithmic exponentiation of like inability to digest stuff, like gut issues, like in the last 5 years. It's unbelievable. Right. So what I would have said 5 years ago is, well, you just slow titrate into it. You start with one apple peel, the skin of one apple one day, and then go to 2, 3, 4, 5. Now I'm having people start with like a quarter of an apple skin, and then over a longer period, just titrate upward. And that's just a good rule, I think, nowadays for any food when you're introducing new foods into the diet. I think the problem a lot of people get into is we think that you're incompatible with a given food, but the issue was a dose problem. You tried to change your diet, and you ate way too much of something too fast. And you had some issue, you had cramping, gas, something, and you conclude, oh, well, I can't have that food. But the issue wasn't that. The issue was the dose relative to time. Sure. Your gut didn't have the taxa necessary to break it down. Yeah. And so I find that's a big deal.
No, that's absolutely right. And so what do you have them do with the rest of the apple?
Oh, you can make cider, you can make fermented, whatever. Yeah.
Got it. Good. Okay, so apple skins, and sorry to dive deeper into this, but I want to really get this down for a protocol for people because I think people, a lot of people suffer from disordered gut microbiome, and it's so good to have a few foods that are extremely beneficial for the gut. And so, I think there's a lot of talk about fiber. There's a lot of talk about fermented foods, but also adding things like apple skins, adding things like resistant starches, so beneficial. And you mentioned 2 other ones. What were the other 2?
Red phenols.
Right. Where do you get red phenols from?
I use a powder. I have a powder I created for it. But you can, there's tons on the market. But there's a lot of different derivatives of red things out there that are they're a podcast in their own. Like a good example is purple corn extract.
Sure.
You could sit there and talk about that for hours. Right, I mean, it's just amazing how it affects macrophages. It does all this cool stuff. So. What did we said? Red phenols. Oh, and then human milk oligosaccharides.
How do we get human milk oligosaccharides?
So originally, when I first came up with this, there was no way to get them apart from baby food, and so this was like 2017. I would just have people go and get the baby food with HMO in it. That was then, and now since then, there's products that have entered the market for it, and so there's about 4 or 5 big companies that make them, and guys like me sell them. So
got it. And so you're taking these from human milk, and then you're purifying them and putting them in a bottle form or a pill form.
No, the way they make them now, for the most part, is they get bacteria to make them. So they'll get a bacteria to essentially create this long chain oligosaccharide, and they just make it in bulk.
Great. And can you get all 4 of these through a supplement, or is it better to get them through food or a combination?
Yeah, great question. So I'm a food first person.
Right.
Like I'm food first. Supplements are supplemental. Right. That's kind of how I view things. So there's 2 phases. There's sort of a reset phase that's leaning on supplements a little more, and then the maintenance phase is leaning on food more. So in the reset phase, you're looking at between 10 to 20 days, depending on where you're at. And you're looking at having human milk oligosaccharides, red phenols, apple skins, and then the other piece of that, the glycine and NAC and that stuff. And you're doing that kind of in the morning and building up your dose tolerance at a rate that's appropriate for where your gut's at. There can be wild variations. Some people, their guts are so sensitive that they're really sensitive to HMOs initially, and it's just they have 0 bifidobacteria, literally, so you got to kind of build that up over time. In that period, sometimes it makes sense to add probiotics, so like a good bifido spectrum, a good lactobacillus spectrum in that period. I'm not a big fan of probiotics indiscriminately. I think there's a great case for them selectively, but the indiscriminate use, I think, has probably done more harm than good. So that's the loading phase, and then in the maintenance phase, the key I think is just really diet, and the key is balance in the diet, so that you don't want too much of the fiber, phenol kind of roots. You don't want too much of that. You want optimal of that along with leafy greens, and then you want optimal protein. You kind of want both because it's the aminos and the protein and the peptides feed the upper gut, feed the intestines, and it's the fibers and the fruits feed the colonocytes and the colon. And so you can kind of see this wonderful structure in the way the colon is built, that one part of it is really best nourished by animal foods, the other part's best kind of nourished by plant foods, and you kind of see that synergy there. And so it's having balance in the diet where you don't have too much of anything, but you have optimal amounts of everything. So.
Got it. And that initial reset phase, how long is that phase for usually for most people?
It could be as short as 10 days. Originally it was 20 days, and I added more goodies into it to get it down. But what I'm seeing now, it's almost like every 6 months, readjusting my lens to see just the level of gut issues that are out there. Just,
digestive issues.
It's like everybody.
Everybody.
Yeah. It's crazy. So the more gut issues you have, the slower I suggest to go in the early going, because you might have to microdose and titrate in a little bit slower just to get up to speed.
Yeah. Yeah. I think this massive upswing of gut issues has a lot to do with the level of toxins in our food right now, totally decimating our gut bacteria. So it takes a long time for our gut to really process the nutritious food because of all the damage done by the non-nutritious, ultra-processed, toxic food, sadly. And so we're seeing, I think a big part of all of this for anyone listening is starting off, the number one thing you can do is eliminate the ultra-processed food from your diet. That has to be number one before you go on any gut reset protocol. And if you're trying to, correct me if I'm wrong, tell me if you agree with this, but if you're trying to reset your gut and then you're out there eating ultra processed food, you're just chasing your tail,
100%,
right?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. I kind of think of that nowadays as almost like, I mean, that should go without saying, and I keep running into the fact that it doesn't. So, thank you for reiterating. It really needs to be said. I mean, it's, in my opinion, the big issue facing all of us for our health going in the next few years is getting access to unadulterated food.
Yeah.
I mean, it's getting so bad, and I read a lot of scary stuff, and it's literally terrifying what is being proposed to do at the genetic molecular level in terms of food. I mean, it's really scary stuff, and it's happening. What's the problem is these things are being onboarded so fast, and there are no rules. It doesn't fit under GMO. It doesn't fit under organic. And so these technologies are being implemented at such a rate right now into the food supply, and the awareness is so low. There's this huge gap, and it could explain a lot.
Absolutely. I mean, and to that point, like, it took our food the way it is in, current form, meaning like maybe 50, 80 years ago form. It took millions of years of evolution to get there. How do we think we're going to do any better by altering the genetics, right?
It's terrifying.
It's terrifying to see what's going to happen, right?
It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
Yeah. I read a thing the other day about taking the mRNA and chloroplasts in leafy greens and, through CRISPR and other new tools, modifying that enough so where that it's capable of modifying or it's capable of working in the human ribosome. I was just like, this can't be. You can't, I mean, in other words, you're eating something that can modify, can make code.
Yeah.
That's scary.
That should be illegal.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's mind blowing that people are actually considering this.
There was, I did something on my Instagram a little while back about, Catherine Austin Fitz runs the Solar Report, and she was talking about there was a state where they proposed that, okay, if you want to make our food do this, then you have to get it approved as a drug first.
Of course.
Yeah, fine if you want to do it, but you got to prove it as a drug. I mean, it's just for things to be at that level.
Yeah. And
the average consumer has zero awareness of this.
I mean, to be honest with you, until you mentioned this right now, I had no awareness that they were doing this level of genetic modification where it's actually modifying our own ribosomes.
It's scary. I had a thing the other day that happened to me where I was just experimenting with kind of like an apple diet. I was playing around. I play around with diets. And I bought these organic apples, and I thought, oh, great, these are high quality. I got them from Sprouts. And I ate half of one, left it on the table, came back a couple hours later. It was not brown. And this is an organic apple. And I just thought, oh, okay. So I went and tracked down the chief scientist for this company, and I emailed her, and, I was like, what's going on here? Is this genetically modified? And she's swearing up and down, no, it's not. No, I'm like, how'd you get the food to do this? She's like, it's just selective breeding. We picked apples that don't brown, and then we kept breeding and breeding and breeding until we got one that doesn't brown. It's just something in my brain just doesn't connect the idea that it's supposed to be organic, but it doesn't brown. Like after 3 days, it's still not brown.
Well, that's even more terrifying because now, we're all taught like the way to avoid GMO food is to buy organic food, right?
Oh, yeah.
But it sounds like it's sneaking into even the organic space.
It absolutely is. So there are I did an Instagram post on this just recently. So some of these new types of genetic modifications don't have to be disclosed as GMO. Some of the ways that they modify things now using like CRISPR or Cas9, they don't have to disclose that as GMO. So,
jeez.
I mean, it's really scary.
That's scary. So how does one find truly non-genetically modified food? How are you doing it?
Yeah, move to Europe. I mean,
exactly. I would say this is a very U.S.-centric problem right now.
Hugely.
Yeah, I mean, we're just further trying to industrialize our food supply, and this is just another symptom of that problem.
And I think like getting our arms around the rapidity of the deployment, the scope. This is a data problem. Yeah. I think it's having readily at your hands data to know, if I buy this apple, what's the history of this apple? If I buy this piece of meat, what's the story on it? Because right now everything's in a black box.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. We don't even know. Like you said, if they're able to avoid regulation around this, then it will forever be in a black box.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like I said, I think getting access to unadulterated food, it's the issue or the health issue.
It is a massive health issue for sure. Moving on from that topic, your first book was about the gut health, right? Mainly, and how to keep your gut healthy and using some of these techniques and proposing a reset diet, and then moving on to a food first kind of program. But also in the food first kind of program, there's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of confusion out there. Can you talk a little bit about your second book, The Way, how you kind of clear some of that up for people? Like what are some of the top 2 or 3 pieces of advice you have for people about food misinformation and confusion?
So the problem I think everybody's facing right now stems from authority, in that you see authority figures saying completely contradicting things. And so it becomes very difficult for the average person to, really know like, well, what makes sense, So one of the things I tried to lay out in the new book was to kind of break down 4 must-have mechanisms. And these are things that, it doesn't matter what else you do. If any one of these 4 things isn't working right, you're not going to have real and lasting health. And these are things that are really tough to debate. Like, so number 1 would be the cardiovascular system. Very tough to have lasting health if the cardiovascular system is not working well. Number 2 is insulin function. You're going to have a hard time being healthy if insulin is compromised in some way. Number 3 is the microbiome. And number 4 is the immune system. And so it's very tough to argue against any one of those 4 things. And what's interesting is you can to a very large degree reverse engineer what's needed to have optimal function of those things. So let's take insulin. Insulin, the first thing the general public probably is not aware of is that insulin doesn't work by itself. It's actually a family of hormones. So you have glucagon, which is the opposite of insulin. And in glucagon and insulin, you can actually see an inherent sort of symmetry or structure where you need both to be stimulated on a regular basis, but not at the same time. They are opposed to one another, okay? And different foods stimulate them. Most people aren't aware of this, but you can actually get glucagon resistance from too much stimulation of glucagon, and then that'll give you insulin resistance. So we see this sort of thing where, I'm going to do my high protein diet, low carb. That's the answer. That's the way. Okay, high protein, low carb. And then what you find over time is you start to get insulin resistant. Right. You start to see, oh, wait a second, I'm getting insulin resistant. Why? And you'll hear people try and kind of poo that away, like, well, that's just physiologic. That'll go away. No, it's not. It's a problem. But just in those 2 hormones, you see a bit of a structure. You see that there's times when one should be stimulated, the other shouldn't, but we need both. And then you can start stacking onto that the incretins. So we have GIP, GLP-1. Different foods stimulate those. And then the stepchild in the family is adiponectin. Maybe the most important. So adiponectin needs to be stimulated. It has a host of pleiotropic effects that impact not just body fat, but impact muscle growth, impact the brain, all kinds of things. Insulin sensitivity. Adiponectin needs to be stimulated. And then all of those rest on a common foundation, which is the microbiome.
Right.
And so we can kind of reverse engineer and say, well, in order to have optimal insulin function, we definitely need these 2 keystone bacteria. We need Bifido, we need Acromancia, and we can starve them out by certain food patterns. Example, going super carnivore for long periods, like years, for example. You're going to reduce your populations of Bifidobacteria over time doing that because you're not feeding it.
Right.
It's primarily saccharolytic fermentation that feeds that.
Right.
You could take the opposite approach. You could look at overeating carbs and just too much on the plant side, too much on the carb side, and you're not getting enough glucagon stimulation. You're not getting enough of some of these other hormones. So we see that collectively there's this equation where you need the optimal microbiome, you need adiponectin, glucagon, GIP, GLP-1, insulin. You need all of these stimulated, and we can kind of start to look at that and go, well, how do we do that with food? How can we hit everything with food, make sure we leave nothing out?
Right.
And so then that's a path that you can go down, and where it will lead, I think, is fascinating. It leads to what I call nature's meal plan. And it's this. It's This whole movement we're in right now is about one thing. It's about civilization breaking our connection to nature.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's what this is about. Okay. So we have all these strategies to compensate. So one is, well, let's put these glasses on at night, and that breaks, the technology separating me from nature. Right. And then let's get in the cold plunge, and that reconnects me to nature's rhythm of hot and cold. And let's go touch grass right now, because that reconnects me to electron flow and all this stuff.
The earth, right? Exactly, yeah.
So when you go down this road, what you quickly come to is probably the most powerful rhythm in nature. And this isn't like some dude trying to make something interesting. I'm just observing what anybody can see for themselves. Anybody can see this. In nature, half of everything is obsessed with killing the other half to eat them. That's life revolves around food.
Circle of life, right.
Nature is obsessed with getting food. And there are repeatable, identifiable, quantifiable patterns of eating that any human being in nature will experience. And they seem to be consistent. And anybody can prove this. You can prove it by watching Alone or watch Naked and Afraid.
Yep.
You can go do a survival course and prove it to yourself. There's any number of ways you can prove this. And it's basically this. You will start out looking for dense, satiating food, fish, game, anything, and you're going to starve along the way and be hungry. Sure. While you're hungry, you're going to consume lesser foods of lesser preference. So that's your meat, that's your roots, that's your mushrooms, that's anything you can get your hands on. Sure. Not your first pick, but you'll eat it, and you're going to be hungry at the same time. So we call that fasting, but the really interesting thing is if you just go to the course and experience this for yourself, what you're going to find is that fasting and foraging have always been dance partners. They've always been dance partners.
Yeah, because they're occurring at the same time.
At the same time, yeah. And that gets really interesting because during a fasted state, nature has provided this way to mimic fasting by feeding the Keystone bacteria that do things like make butyrate, which protects you from muscle loss and all kinds of things, turns up HDAC inhibition, all these cool big words. And it seems to happen in a fasted state where you're foraging. Then the next rhythm of nature is feasting. So you caught a salmon, you ate the whole thing all at once, and that's your preference. But then you go back to being hungry and foraging. And then there's a season of abundance. The season of abundance is, the herd came in and we got 20 buffalo and we're eating good for 6 months, and that's what we're eating mostly. But what you find is that nature will provide a season of abundance, but it doesn't provide continual abundance, okay? So what nature does quite by accident is it forces us to kind of eat this variety in the diet where we're not necessarily getting too much of anything. And if you do have a season of abundance, just know that it's going to go away and you're going to, your diet's going to shift out. And so that pattern that nature provides naturally hits everything in the insulin family, everything. It's those leafy greens that you didn't want to eat when you were foraging that made the phytates that stimulate insulin, stimulate adiponectin. It's those nuts that you ground into a meal and made that, stimulate the GLP-1, the GIP. Nature has a way of doing that. Well, that's missing from today's diets. If you go through and you begin to quantify all these different diets, and you begin to look at so how does this diet impact insulin? You go keto. You go, yeah, so up front we see these improvements in insulin sensitivity seems to work wonders, but then the long term, we see a down regulation of certain things and it's maybe not so good. What about carnivore? Yeah, same thing. We see it seems to improve things up front really good, but then long term we're getting this upregulation of gluconeogenesis in the liver. We're getting a decrease in peripheral glucose uptake, and it seems to be that it's because you're hitting glucagon a lot. You're not really hitting insulin. You're depriving the microbiome of what it needs. So we can reverse engineer this. And it's kind of time we did. It's not that hard. So,
right.
And that's just
the
insulin.
Mechanisms. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's almost like, like you mentioned, like nature has cycles and our biology is built to function optimally with those cycles. So in periods of starvation, our body, is programmed basically to hold on to as much energy as it can for preparing for starvation time, right? And the opposite is true. Like in periods of abundance, you're able to utilize this energy much better and more rapidly. But right now, the way our current food system is built, we have everything at all times, right? And so we don't go through these cycles.
Right, and that's the problem.
That's the problem. Right?
Continual abundance, continual abundance. So this is the thing that I think the average person can get their arms around to break confusion. And it's this. It's one word. It's scarcity. Scarcity is the crux mechanism in nature that we don't have.
Right.
So what scarcity does is it drives diversity into the diet. Diversity is the byproduct, the inevitable byproduct
Of scarcity.
Yes. And nature's rhythms involve scarcity. So if you want to go touch grass and get cold and put the glasses on, you might want to figure out how to re-engineer scarcity back into what you're doing, because that's the most important rhythm you find. You look at anything alive in nature and all it's thinking about is getting something to eat. That's all it's thinking about. Like during the waking hours, food is the focus and scarcity is the driver. So
yeah, absolutely. So we all live in the modern world. We live in this world right now. How do we simulate this scarcity? How do we simulate this seasonality? What is your recommendation there?
So I'll give you the simple version, and it's really simple, and then we can make it as complex as we want.
Let's do it.
So the simple version is you have a foraging food date, followed by a very short fast, followed by feasting foods, and that's it. And then you just repeat that pattern.
Is that a day-to-day pattern? Or a week-to-week pattern? Or?
That gets to the interesting part.
Okay.
So everything is in buckets of time.
Okay.
And so we have basically like we have two different 24-hour patterns. We connect them together, and we fit those into a 7-day pattern. Now, this is the missing part in Nutrition Today. One of them is that there really is something to chrononutrition and the 7-day cycle. You can prove it when you look at immunology and you look at drug dissemination, and there's certain drugs. Yeah, this drug's better on a Wednesday. That one's better on a Saturday. So there's something to this days of the week thing. So you can take that 48-hour cycle, and now you can tailor it into 7 days, and then you can take that 7-day cycle, and then you can tailor that into seasons. And so that's the idea.
Interesting. Okay, so what were the 3 cycles?
So you have a basic 48-hour pattern.
Right.
Okay, and that first day is foraging foods.
Okay.
Usually that day's subcaloric. Okay. There's variations.
And when you say foraging, you're talking mostly like vegetables, green leafies, those kind of things, roots.
Berries, nuts, roots. Like example that I might do typical day like that. I might do like blueberries and walnuts at breakfast, and then lunch I might do like a purple sweet potato, and then dinner might be some white meat chicken with some leafy greens.
Okay. So
that's that first day.
Okay.
Surprisingly, don't get hungry on that. Really weird. You think you would, but you don't. And then the second day is just leads into what I call the amplified fast. So the whole idea with that is, like you, I went through a period, it was about 2011, and I was fasting all the time, taking carbon 60 and every antioxidant known, and I got to a place where I was completely sore all the time, small, shrunken, and I hated it. It was horrible. Yeah. And I kind of figured out this doesn't really work. What came out of that was, with this whole microbiome thing, was kind of figuring out, well, these Keystone bacteria actually replicate fasting. When you go and you look at like all the benefits you want to get during fasting, you want to turn up autophagy, you want to turn up HDAC inhibition, you want to turn up AMPK, you want to turn up all this stuff. Well, these bacteria in a foraging state kind of do that. It's really interesting when you map this out. It's really, really interesting. So there's this thing we missed, which is nature kind of gave us this way to optimize fitness when food is scarce by turning up all these bacteria that turn up these pathways, so that when food does come in, the body's primed to harvest those nutrients, and it's taken all the waste products and got rid of them. So my experience with fasting was that, there's you can really complicate things. You can disrupt sleep. You can disrupt your eating cycles, blah, blah. I just kind of came to this place where it's like there are benefits to fasting, but the ideal way to do it is to replicate what happens in nature, where you prime it with the foraging foods, you fire all those pathways up, and then you have a very, very short fast, like to noon maybe. Yeah. So all you're doing is really adding 4 hours on.
Okay.
And then during that fast, that's when you get max activation for all the things we would like to do. So that's when cold plunging can come in. That's when sprints and deadlifts, replicating what our ancestors did in a starved state with all those longevity pathways turned up, and then having to exert yourself, having to do something hard, lift something heavy, get cold, all that. That's when your max pathway activation, all that stuff, a couple times a week of that is fantastic. Yeah. So
it's so interesting that we now have the science to see biologically what our hormone levels are, what our stress levels are, et cetera. We can look at this now through actual measurement, and we can see what works the best is to just follow basically what nature created for us as far as patterns go and eating patterns, being outside, being in the cold, hot, dark, light. All of it is just following nature's patterns of what optimally allows our bodies to function at the highest level.
Yeah.
So, and we spend so much time and energy trying to replicate that with technologies like cold plunge and saunas and, and unfortunately, it's all just taking us into a place right now in our current civilization that we think we need all of that. We need to have this all the time. But in reality, it's just going backwards in time and living according to nature's patterns, what you're talking about.
Yeah. It's
so mind-blowing. What other pieces of advice, you mentioned a few other things that you talk about in your book. What are some of the other big pieces of advice you can give to listeners?
Well, I think it's to understand it's to understand that there are synergies inherent to opposing food groups. So we've gone down this road of vilifying opposing food groups. Yeah. So like there's this thing of like meat's good, leafy greens are bad. Okay. But actually, and this makes so much sense when you just kind of just think about it for a second, it makes sense nature would build synergies into different foods. They complement one another. And this is actually like quantifiable now. You can actually see this. So a good example would be meat by itself in massive amounts over very long periods. You can accumulate things that you maybe don't want to accumulate. You could maybe accumulate too much heme iron. You could accumulate too much Fusobacteria. You could lower the pH of the colon. Kind of things we really don't want. But we can easily solve those problems, like stupid easy, by just adding in a little bit of leafy greens or a little bit of something kind of stocky, which shifts the locus of fermentation, raises the pH back of the colon. And so what you find is that quite the opposite of what we've been sold on, that there's this exclusivity or this dogmatic kind of exclusionary aspect of diet. Only these foods are good, those are bad. It's actually the reverse. The truth is that the foods we're told were bad often protect you from the deleterious aspects of too much of the thing you say is good.
Right.
And so there's this marvelous synergy that nature has built in that we could be taking advantage of. And it's just really based on, if you just think about scarcity keeps you from eating too much of anything, but it sure makes it makes sure that your diet is diverse. It makes sure that there's variety. And then your own natural inclinations are always going to lead you to what you want. But it's just that foods can work synergistically together. They're not, and we're in this age now where it's like, no, I'm never eating dairy again. I'm never eating greens. I'm never eating grains again. There's research now, very interesting. For every 1,000 calories you take in, if you will add 50 grams of grains in with that, muscle synthesis rates are increased significantly over just protein alone.
Right.
It's fascinating.
Right. Yeah. And I read some of that research. It's really interesting. It just goes to show you, like you said, diversity is really the key to the diets. And so I think to kind of sum things up for listeners, support your microbiome. Number one, eliminate the ultra-processed food. Be very careful where you're buying your food from. There's a lot of it sneaking into our diets now. Even in the organic space, you have to be careful because of GMOs and things like that. Step two then is supporting your microbiome, realizing that unfortunately our microbiome is getting more and more challenged every day to maintain beneficial species. And you have some great food-based solutions and also supplement-based solutions to help support your microbiome. And then when you're looking at your diet big picture, and I would love to have people read The Way, because I feel like you described this very well, is introducing some of those periods of scarcity and abundance into your diet, keeping it as diverse as possible, right? And making sure that you're considering all food groups because they do interact with each other. And that's a science that we haven't figured out yet is super complicated. But just like you said, like our intuition and our just being in nature should tell us that this is what we're meant to be. Just being omnivores, this is what we're meant to do, is have different types of foods, protein, plants, all of it together, right?
Yeah, it all can work together in really great ways to optimize health. The issue that we're in now is a conflation of the food grade. Like we have various grades of any food.
Absolutely.
And so you can always get higher grades of food. Maybe that becomes a cost issue, but it's really when you start talking about the ubiquitous deployment of low-grade foods or adulterated foods, that's really the issue we're talking about. One thing we could maybe, if we have time, didn't talk about would be the cardiovascular system.
Let's talk about that, yeah.
Such a huge thing.
I would love to, yeah.
So, and this is just something, again, this is just my opinion. I'm not a cardiologist. Who am I? I'm just, but I would just throw this out that, we are in this era where thinking is so polarized. And in my first book, I called it baby talk. It's this tendency to want to hyperpolarize in one direction or another and really kind of discard any idea of nuance or that something could be, maybe not as simple as we'd like it to be. And so there's this, particularly what we're seeing now is this kind of reversing field when it comes to cholesterol and saturated fats. And so we had the diet heart health hypothesis for X amount of years and, looking at cholesterol and saturated fat and going down this road of different stages of that and looking at, well, first, it's the villain and blah, blah. And now we've come to the other extreme now where I see a lot of influencers who are on the other polar extreme. A lot of them really well credentialed. And basically it's that in that belief structure, there's no amount of saturated fat that could be detrimental. None.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting topic because you have two extremes now. You have one extreme, which is the kind of the traditionalists, which is, well, no, actually, yeah, it can definitely be an issue. And the other extreme is, no, absolutely not. The mainstream's wrong, blah, blah, blah. And going back to the very first question we talked about, they've completely negated the impact of time.
Right, exactly.
So what we see is with age is that there are structural changes in the cardiovascular system. Some of them are the result of decades of accumulation of things like oxysterols, for example. But these structural changes, many of them are just age-related. So, for example, there's the NOx enzymes or the NADPH oxidases. These are critical enzymes, the only oxidative enzymes in the body. They tend to go hyperactive as we get older. They can oxidize saturated fats, but saturated fats can also activate the NADPH oxidases. And then at the same time, the other structures like the glycocalyx begin to decline in the vasculature, tends to open up the vasculature. We get leaky vessels. So at the same time, then you have decades of accumulation of oxysterols. And so what we have is this sort of time-dependent equation where at one point in time, maybe something was no issue whatsoever, but at another point in time, it could be very serious. It could be very serious. And so there's this sort of black or white, no. There's nothing, no circumstance where you could get too much saturated. It's all wrong, all of it. And I just hear this stuff and I just think, man, this blows my mind. I've read a lot of ancestral studies and what the consensus seems to be, and nobody's got a time machine, nobody knows for sure, but the consensus seems to be that our ancestors didn't eat unlimited saturated fats. There was an optimal ratio, about 7 to 12, 15% of the diet, maybe 30% fat total. So there's kind of an ancestral optimum that was there.
Sure.
And we're in this age now of this is just one example of these hyper-polarized views that, first of all, time doesn't matter. That's not a variable. Don't ever bring that up. How dare you? And then there's no limits. There's no such thing as homeostasis. You have as much as you want. Go ahead, kill it. This is the way. That's the way. And so it's just these hyperpolarizations of thinking with regard to diet are symptomatic, I think, of bigger problems of thought. But, they're worth talking about and they're worth mentioning. Yeah.
It's so true. Like, people forget that time exists as a dimension and things change over time. And humans throughout evolution lived to be 30, 40 years at the most until we made modern medicines to allow us to live longer. And so the accumulation of time, damage over time, and just changes over time is accelerated as we age past that initial lifespan of humans, right? And so to your point, things will affect you differently later on in life as they did at the beginning.
Thank you again. Thank you.
And so you
it's like the first doctor I've heard say this.
Right. And so, in fact, even look at studies, all these research studies that are done, they do control for a lot of variables, but sometimes they don't control for the variable of time. Exactly.
Yes.
And so just because whatever therapeutic, whatever you're studying, it's going to affect you differently in your 20s versus your 40s versus your 60s, right? And we're actually seeing this now in some of the more recent research. You probably read over the last few months, there's research coming out showing that there's definite periods of times where things dramatically change. Sometimes and those times are like at the age of 44 and 60. Mm-hmm. There's massive changes in our the levels of different proteins in our bloods, the rate of acceleration of decline of our cells, et cetera. And you really got to think about, like, to your point, you really have to think about that things are definitely changing over time, and they're also changing at different rates at different times. And so we have to constantly be evolving in what we're doing, our diet, our sleep, our nutrition, our exercise, our movement. All of it needs to change.
It's so refreshing to hear you say that. Yeah. Like, because it blows my mind. I see like doctors that just don't even say, like they're acting like time's not a variable. I mean, it is a variable. I'm just a dumb consumer.
It is, and I think as more as we start talking about this more, and people like yourself is bringing this to the forefront, I think we just all have to change our thinking about how we think about different stages of our life, and what worked at one point will not work at another point, and so it's not this is the right way now.
Yes,
it might be the right way right now at this moment.
Right,
but it might not be that way all the time.
Well said.
To your point.
Yep.
I love your message. It's fantastic. I think, makes me want to read both your books now. I read parts of both of your books, but I want to read the whole thing and really understand. And I also think there's a lot of benefit to your gut reset. I really think you've thought it out very well. And I think you found compounds that could be really beneficial. And so definitely for patients that are struggling with their gut health, I think it's a good starting point sometimes for people just to have that reset protocol and see how that works, right?
Yeah, that came out of the need to create the maximum delta with the minimum input.
Yes.
And so that was like as good a place as any to start, where you may not be able to get off the couch and go do sprints, but you could start eating some apple peels and you could kind of just do this. And I've just seen it work. I mean, I've seen it.
That's fantastic. Well, so great having you on the podcast. Thank you so much. A lot of great information. Some of it's very sciencey, but you made it very practical for us as well, giving us some really good protocols. What's next for you? What are you looking at doing next?
Thank you, by the way. It's been great. Yeah. I'm kind of just shrink wrapping this whole thing I've been doing now for many years. And I would like to, just see this gut reset get out to everybody on the planet, because I've seen it work, particularly on old people. I've seen people who are, they're just getting older, and they're not going to go drop 100 pounds. I can just tell you right now, they're not going to drop. But their quality of life and the changes and the shifts that, they come back like 5 days later, 10 days later, and like, oh my gosh, my energy is so good, and I feel so much better, and I'm not achy, and so to me, that's kind of like the one shift I think I can create, and so I'm just focusing on scaling that now. Yeah,
that's fantastic. How do people find you?
You can find me at veepnutrition.com, which is or theic.health. My Instagram is real Joel Greene, and also stacks are next. Cannot
Stacks.
wait.
Let's do.
That's the next big thing. Can't wait for that. That's a big deal to me, actually.
Yeah. Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah. At Vitaboom.com.
Yes.
You're going to have a stacks that actually take people through your protocol and move them forward as well, right?
Yeah. I've been, actually, it's so funny. This was such a timely thing. So in my little fast, you do 2-3 days a week. There are different things you could focus on. Like you do senolysis, you could do anti-inflammation, you could do different things. And so this couldn't be at a better time of like, okay, well, here's the senolysis stack, here's this stack, So yeah, excited.
Love it. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for everything, and look forward to everything you're doing and maybe having you on again sometime.
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you.